The supply cart squeaked, a sound like a wounded animal, as Natalie Hayes rolled it down the Sacred Heart ICU corridor at 3 in the morning. Her hands moved through the routine with the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory so deep it bypassed thought entirely. Saline bags aligned in descending order. Trauma shears positioned at precisely 2 o'clock on the crash cart. Endotracheal tubes sorted by size, 7.0, 7.5, 8.0. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects, casting everything in the color of old snow. She was 43 years old, and no one at Sacred Heart had any idea that those trembling hands had once held a child's intestines together while mortar rounds shook the walls of a field hospital 20 years ago. No one knew that the slight limp in her right leg came from shrapnel, or that her left ear barely registered sound anymore because an IED had stolen most of it along with her faith in anything permanent. She kept her head down. She worked night rotation because night rotation was when she could be alone, when the senior doctors were home in their houses with their families, when the fluorescent lights became the only witnesses to how perfectly those trembling hands still moved when they mattered. Dr. Richard Ashford barely noticed her. In his mind, Natalie occupied the same mental category as the hospital's vending machines: present, functional, invisible. When he saw her in the hallway, she registered as reliable warm body, nothing more. The name tag that read Ven Hayes, RN, might as well have been a barcode. She was the one who stayed late without complaining, who covered shifts no one else wanted, who never made demands or drew attention. That was how Ashford preferred his staff: competent enough to be useful, unremarkable enough to never threaten his reputation. The ICU smelled like antiseptic, and something underneath it, the smell of people whose bodies were giving up. Natalie had stopped finding the smell objectionable around year 2 of her employment. She walked through it the way other people walked through rain, as if the hospital's atmosphere was simply the medium she moved through now, inevitable as gravity. It was Tuesday 3:17 a.m., when the call came down from administration. A Marine commander was being transferred from Lausanne for emergency preoperative evaluation. Not a routine admission. This was the kind of call that made phones ring in executive offices, that made Ashford check his reflection in his office window and practice his concerned physician expression. Natalie overheard the intake coordinator on the phone in the break room, her voice pitched high with a kind of excitement that only military hierarchy could generate. "Yes, Commander Reese. Trauma background. Requesting Sacred Heart specifically. Routed to Dr. Ashford." The words fell like stones into still water. She had frozen mid-sip of coffee that had been sitting there since midnight, gone cold and bitter. Her right hand, the dominant one, had started its familiar tremor, that small shaking that came when her nervous system remembered things her conscious mind was determined to forget. She steadied it with her left palm against the table's edge, a motion so automatic that nobody watching would have recognized it as anything but a casual lean. The break room was empty except for one resident bent over a laptop, typing up charts. Natalie set down her coffee with care, the mug making a soft clink against the formica. "Marine Commander." The words arranged themselves in her mind in a way that made her breath catch, but only internally. Externally, she was perfectly composed. She was always perfectly composed. That was the first thing they taught you in the field: control your face and you control the situation. She went back to restocking the ICU. She had 3 more carts to fill before sunrise. The crash cart in Bay 7 needed reorganizing. Someone had left the defibrillator pads in the wrong drawer, which was the kind of small chaos that could cost seconds in an emergency, and seconds were the distance between alive and dead. The hospital's administrative office was on the 2nd floor, and she didn't have a specific reason to go there until she did. The intake files were logged in a holding system near the main desk, and at 4:06 a.m., when the day shift staff hadn't yet arrived and the night administrative supervisor was making rounds, the hallway was empty enough that she could stand for 30 seconds reading a patient folder through the glass of the conference room window. Commander Jacob Reese. Age 28. Medical photo clipped to the outside of his file: dark hair, the kind of bone structure that suggested he'd been carved by someone who understood symmetry, a small scar above his left eyebrow that looked like it had a story. And then her entire nervous system went white hot. She knew that scar. She had seen it when he was 8 years old, when it was still fresh and swollen, when he had been dying on a stretcher in a field hospital that smelled like blood and diesel fuel and the copper-hot smell of things burning outside the perimeter. Natalie's hand moved without permission, reaching for the dog tag under her scrubs. The metal was warm from her body heat, and her fingers found it the way a compass finds north. Single chain. Broken links welded together 3 times. On one side, her own name and serial number, from her father's service. On the other side, scratched into the metal with a surgical blade because she had no other tool, Jacob R., Kandahar, 2004. She had kept it for 19 years and 11 months and 17 days. She could say that number without thinking about it, the way some people remembered their wedding anniversary. She wore it under her scrubs at night, when no one was looking, when the fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell and the sounds of machines keeping people alive became too much. The folder said he was coming for a trauma evaluation. Preoperative assessment. Something had happened to Commander Reese that required surgery from Sacred Heart's top surgeon. Natalie pulled her hand back to her side. She turned away from the window. She walked back to the ICU to finish her supply carts with the same steady gait she always used, the left ear that barely worked turned slightly toward sounds, the tremor in her right hand pressed flat against the cart's handle. When you have survived things that should have killed you, you learn how to compartmentalize. You learn that feelings are data, just like vital signs, and you can observe them without being controlled by them. The recognition flooding through her system, blood pressure rising, pupils dilating, adrenaline beginning its cascading sequence, she noted it all the way a trauma surgeon notes a patient's response to acute injury. Documented. Filed. Managed. But when she was alone in Bay 4, checking the central line dressing on the sleeping patient there, her fingers found the dog tag again, and she held it so tightly that the broken chain left a mark on her palm. Commander Jacob Reese. 8 years old, dying of hemorrhagic shock in Kandahar, his father killed in the same IED strike that shredded half his abdomen. She had been 23 years old, a junior medical officer attached to 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, working in a field hospital that was under fire half the day. She had a combat knife because that was all she had, and she had his blood on her hands when she performed the thoracotomy, cracking his ribs open while rounds hit the sandbags outside, while the world exploded, and she kept his heart beating with her own hands until the medevac halo arrived. She had given him her dog tag when they loaded him on the helicopter because he was scared and crying and looking for something to hold on to, and she had no comfort to offer except the weight of metal, the promise embedded in military brass that somebody cared whether he lived or died. That was 20 years ago. He had been transferred to Walter Reed. She had never heard if he survived. She had learned not to ask. Soldiers learn to let go of their patients the way they learn to let go of everything else, with clinical precision, with acceptance that attachment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Dr. Ashford arrived at 5:30, which was early for him. He walked through the ICU with his phone pressed to his ear, already conducting business before the sun came up. His voice had that particular resonance of someone used to being listened to, the kind of authority that comes from expensive schools and inherited confidence and the assumption that the world would arrange itself according to his preference. Natalie was checking vitals on the patient in Bay 2, her fingers on the radial pulse of a 72-year-old man recovering from cardiac surgery. Her voice was carefully modulated when she reported BP 98/62. Heart rate stable at 84. O2 sat 96 on 2 liters. Ashford didn't respond. He was already moving past her toward his office, phone still pressed to his ear, his expression suggesting that the ICU's entire population was merely backdrop for his day. But when the preoperative evaluation began, Natalie was assigned to take Commander Reese's vitals. It was the kind of routine assignment that happened 100 times a day, the kind of assignment that no one thought twice about. She walked into the evaluation room at 7:15 a.m., blood pressure cuff in her left hand, pulse oximeter in her right, her face arranged in the expression of professional neutrality that she had perfected across 3 years of keeping herself invisible at Sacred Heart. Commander Reese sat on the examination table in a hospital gown, his muscular frame somehow diminished by the fact that he was out of uniform. His left arm bore a fresh trauma site, some kind of acute injury that had prompted this urgent evaluation. He looked up when she entered, and for 1 second, just one, she saw the 8-year-old boy in his face. The same eyes. The same small scar above the left eyebrow, older now, integrated into the architecture of his adult face. Natalie's right hand trembled as she reached for his arm. It wasn't fear. She had learned the difference between fear and something deeper, something that came from recognizing the shape of your own history standing in front of you in a hospital gown. The tremor was restraint. It was the sound of someone who had learned to keep all the important things locked away where they couldn't hurt anyone. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his bicep with methodical precision. "This might be tight," she said, and her voice, when it emerged, was perfectly steady. No recognition. No history. Just a nurse doing her job at 7 in the morning in Jacksonville, Florida, taking the vital signs of a patient who happened to be alive because of something she had done 2 decades ago in a war zone. 99/61, she reported, keeping her eyes on the digital readout. Not at his face. Never at his face. Heart rate 92. O2 sat 98. "You doing okay? Any dizziness?" He said something, some polite response, but she was already moving, already turning away, already beginning the practice motion of removing the cuff. Her fingers found the dog tag under her scrubs again, just briefly, and she pressed it once against her sternum before moving toward the door. That was when Dr. Ashford arrived, and his eyes, sharp, cataloging, predatory in the way that senior physicians could be predatory, noticed everything. He noticed the tremor in her hands. He noticed that she had positioned herself at an unusual distance from the patient. He noticed the way her breathing had changed, subtle but present, like someone who had just been running. He was a man who had built his career on noticing details that other people missed, on using those details to construct narratives that benefited Richard Ashford. His eyes moved between Natalie and Commander Reese like a predator evaluating prey, and in that moment, something shifted. The temperature in the room didn't change, but it felt like it had. The air pressure felt different. The quality of the light seemed to alter. Ashford smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reaches the mouth but never touches the eyes. "Thank you, Hayes," he said, using her last name in the way that made clear she was interchangeable, unremarkable, the functional equivalent of a piece of equipment. "I'll take it from here." Natalie turned toward the door. She didn't run. She didn't show anything on her face. She simply left the room with the same steady pace she used for everything, while behind her she felt something beginning to shift, the way you feel a pressure system change before a storm hits. Something in Ashford's expression suggested he had seen the way her hands had trembled. More than that, he had seen her see the patient, and he was already calculating how to use that information. She walked back to the ICU, and her hands were completely steady now. That was how you survived. You acknowledged the tremor, and then you locked it away, and then you kept working. The patient she had left waiting in Bay 2 still needed vitals checked. The crash cart still needed organizing. The fluorescent light still hummed overhead like the sound of the world grinding on, indifferent to the small catastrophes and recognitions that happened in the shadows beneath them. The crash cart still needed organizing, but Natalie wasn't the one who would organize them anymore. Dr. Ashford was already waiting in the supply closet when she rounded the corner with an armload of sterile gauze packets, waiting with the kind of stillness that meant he'd been planning this moment since the intake examination that morning. "Inside. Now." His voice was a blade dressed in professionalism. She stepped into the narrow space between shelves of saline bags and oxygen masks. The fluorescent panel above flickered once, twice, casting his face in intervals of shadow. His jaw was locked tight, and his eyes had that particular shine of someone who'd already decided the verdict before the trial began. That charting. He didn't raise his voice, but the quiet made it worse. The control made it lethal. The pre-op intake on Commander Reese. Blood pressure in the medication column. Timing off by 30 minutes. Do you understand what that looks like to an accreditation board? Natalie kept her hand steady on the gauze packets. Her voice came out measured, each word placed like a surgical instrument. Those were pre-filled by day shift. I corrected them during intake. You also contaminated a sterile field by reaching for personal items mid-examination. He leaned against the shelf, and she caught the faint copper scent of his cologne mixing with antiseptic. His wife noticed. His daughter noticed. I had to spend 5 minutes reassuring them that we maintain professional standards on this floor. She said nothing. Silence was a form of armor. And then Ashford stepped closer, his shadow merging with hers on the wall behind her. I watched your hand shake when you took vitals. I watched you slip something into your pocket. A chain, wasn't it? Some kind of necklace. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It moved across his face like oil on water. Are you sure you're stable enough to be handling high-profile cases, Natalie? Because shaky is what people are calling you in the break room, and I'm wondering if that's accurate assessment or just cruel observation. Natalie felt the blood shift in her veins. Not a flush. Not trembling. Just a recalibration, the same internal reset she'd learned in Kandahar when mortar fire was close enough that you could smell the exhaust. One measured breath. Then another. My hands work fine when it matters, she said, meeting his eyes without breaking contact. One tear escaped her left eye, and not from the insult, but from the sheer weight of holding herself together in the space where she couldn't move. She wiped it with her left index finger and didn't look away. Ashford's jaw tightened slightly. That wasn't the reaction he wanted. He wanted her to apologize, to spiral, to become the liability he was already describing in his mental narrative. Instead, she stood there with wet eyes and a steady gaze like a soldier waiting out artillery fire. We'll see how you perform, he said finally. If you can perform. For now, you're being reassigned to night rotation effective immediately. Restricted from Commander Reese's ICU care and post-operative checks. It's a patient safety measure, you understand. Nothing personal. Everything about it was personal. They both knew it. She nodded once and turned to leave, but he wasn't finished. Oh, and Natalie. His voice followed her into the hallway. I'd recommend keeping your personal life separate from work. Boundaries matter. People notice when they don't exist. That evening, after the schedule had been printed and distributed to every locker on the floor, Natalie sat in the break room with her container of leftover grilled chicken and steamed broccoli, the kind of sad, measured lunch of someone who'd learned long ago that food was fuel, not comfort. She unwrapped it slowly, methodically, and opened the latest issue of the Journal of Emergency Medicine someone had left on the table. The 3 nurses at the corner table, Jennifer from trauma, Marcus's mom from pediatrics, and the newer resident whose name Natalie could never quite remember, looked up simultaneously. The eye contact lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then all 3 stood in perfect synchronization, gathered their containers and water bottles without a word, and walked out of the break room. Jennifer made deliberate eye contact as she passed, the kind of contact that wasn't about acknowledgement but about marking territory. The room felt larger after they left. Sound carried differently in empty spaces. The refrigerator hummed its low mechanical song. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm. Natalie took one measured breath and ate her lunch alone. The chicken was cold. The broccoli had the texture of rubber that had been steamed twice. She finished every bite anyway, chewing with mechanical precision, reading about new protocols for managing septic shock. By the time she was done, 37 minutes had passed and the break room was still empty. The next morning, the disciplinary notice appeared on the unit board in the main hallway where the morning shift did their handoffs and discussed patient census. The document was printed on official Sacred Heart letterhead, laminated for permanence, pinned at the 4 corners like something that wasn't going anywhere. Disciplinary notice, N. Hayes, emotional instability during patient interactions. Boundary violations with patient family members. Charting errors and documentation failures. Restricted from participation in Commander James Reese case. Remedial training in professional protocols required. Effective immediately. Signed by Dr. Robert Ashford, attending physician, surgery division. 23 staff members saw it during their morning briefing. Nurses, techs, residents, one of the surgical schedulers who came up from downstairs. They read it, processed it, and filed it into the mental category where Sacred Heart kept its known liabilities. The woman who couldn't keep it together. The woman who maybe needed help. The woman who'd been marked. Natalie read it at 7:03 a.m., standing in her street clothes before she'd changed into scrubs. She read every word. The date. The signature. The careful way Ashford had phrased things, not accusations, but observations, not dismissals but safety measures. She read it twice, her face completely still except for the small muscle working in her jaw like a clock mechanism ticking off seconds. Then she walked to her locker without a word, changed into her scrubs with the same precision, and clocked in for her day's shift, which would be her last day's shift for the foreseeable future. Tonight rotation started at 9 p.m. Night rotation meant 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., which meant she would never be in the ICU during the hours when Commander Reese received his post-operative checks, when Dr. Ashford made his rounds, when anything that mattered actually happened on the surgical floor. She understood what he was doing. Compartmentalization. Containment. Ensuring that whatever connection existed between her and the commander, whatever knowledge she carried, whatever history she kept pressed against her heart in the shape of a dog tag on a broken chain, would be isolated to the night shift, where nothing critical occurred, where her presence wouldn't matter. The irony was sharp enough to cut. But that wasn't the worst part of what Ashford was building. At 2 p.m., while Natalie was still on day shift, he made his first phone call from his private office with the door closed. Then his second. By 5 p.m., 3 different schedules had been rewritten in the hospital's computer system, and a formal memo had been sent to the unit supervisor about patient safety protocols. By 7 p.m., when Natalie clocked out for the evening and headed to her car in the parking lot, Ashford was already 3 moves ahead on a board game she didn't even know they were playing. She sat in her vehicle for 18 minutes before starting the engine. The sun was setting over Jacksonville, bleeding orange across the wet asphalt from an earlier rain. Her hands rested on the steering wheel at 2 and 10, exactly as she'd been trained to hold them. Steady. Ready. Waiting for whatever came next. When she finally pulled out of the parking lot, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She didn't look at it until she was home. The message was from Marcus's school, a routine attendance notification. She deleted it and sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness of her small apartment, listening to the sound of traffic on the street below, feeling the weight of the dog tag hidden beneath her scrubs like a secret that was about to stop being secret. The next morning, Dr. Ashford arrived at Sacred Heart 40 minutes before rounds, his laptop already open on his office desk. The fluorescent panel above him buzzed with the particular insistence of something about to fail. He stared at Natalie's file, not the official one, but the screenshots he'd taken during intake. The emergency thoracotomy footage would play in his favor. Dangerous. Unstable. A nurse operating far beyond her scope of practice, putting Commander Reese at risk during a critical post-operative window. He picked up his desk phone at 6:17 a.m. Chief Patterson? It's Dr. Ashford. We have a patient safety issue I need to report. His voice carried the practiced gravity of a man accustomed to being believed. One of our nurses performed an unauthorized surgical procedure in the ICU last night. Needle decompression without physician supervision. I have witnesses. Yes. Natalie Hayes. Cardiac floor trauma nurse. He paused, listening to the chief's response. Then, I understand this requires immediate escalation. I'm prepared to file a formal report. The first call ended at 6:23 a.m. The second call came at 6:31 a.m. Human Resources? Dr. Ashford from Surgical Services. I need to initiate immediate termination proceedings for a staff member. Insubordination and violation of clinical scope of practice. The name is Natalie Hayes, badge number 4827. He spelled it out, each letter landing like a gavel strike. I want her badge deactivated before her shift starts. Yes, right now. She's a liability. He hung up before HR could ask questions. The third call was to the State Nursing Board Licensing Division in Tallahassee. Ashford explained that he'd witnessed a licensed practical nurse, he was careful with the title, slightly understating her credentials, perform invasive surgical procedures without physician authorization, potentially endangering a flag officer. He requested an immediate investigation and suggested that her license be flagged pending review. The call lasted 6 minutes. By 6:45 a.m., an official complaint would be logged. The fourth call was the most careful. His attorney, Martin Friedlich, picked up on the second ring. "Martin, I need documentation." Ashford's voice had shifted into something colder, more calculated. "A nurse in my department overstepped protocol. Dangerous situation. Potential liability for the hospital. I want contemporaneous notes on my desk today, something dated and time-stamped showing I reported it immediately. I'm concerned about institutional liability." "Yes. Today." He waited. "And Martin? I need this to be airtight. I need every motion to her file to show I was protecting patient safety." By 7:02 a.m., the institutional machinery was moving. Natalie arrived at Sacred Heart at 6:55 a.m. for her shift, her badge still in her pocket from the previous day. The security desk had never asked for it. She swiped at the employee entrance and felt the gate lock resist. Once. Twice. A red light blinked where green should have been. The guard, a man named Robert who'd let her pass every morning for 3 years, wouldn't meet her eyes. "Your access has been suspended," he said quietly. "As of 6:53 a.m. You're not authorized to enter the facility." She stood there, hand still on the card reader, the weight of the dog tag beneath her scrub suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. "I have a shift." "I know. But I can't let you through. There's a memo from Human Resources. You need to call them before coming back." Robert's jaw clenched slightly, the expression of a man who disliked delivering bad news. "I'm sorry, Natalie." She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She simply turned and walked back to her car, each step measured and deliberate, the kind of motion you use when your hands want to tremble and you're determined they won't. Not here. Not where anyone could see. Inside, Dr. Ashford was already in his office, taking a call from the Chief of Staff. "I understand the urgency," Ashford was saying. "I'm prepared to testify about what I witnessed. No, I don't believe she was trying to help. I believe she was attempting to demonstrate expertise she clearly doesn't have in a high-stress situation." He paused. "Yes, she was assigned to night rotation specifically to limit patient contact. This is exactly what I was concerned about." By 8:15 a.m., Human Resources had cleared out her locker. They'd done it quietly, professionally, the way you do things that need to look procedurally sound. Her scrubs, her water bottle with a faded unit patch sewn into the lining, her personal phone charger, everything sealed in a cardboard box that was currently sitting in the HR office. They'd even included the cracked ceramic mug from the break room, the one that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from the trauma team 2 years ago. The kind of thing you didn't think about until it was gone. Natalie drove through Jacksonville's morning traffic without heading home. Instead, she found herself at the north end of River Street near the bus terminal, where the rain had started coming down in thick, patient sheets that made the asphalt gleam like tarnished silver. She parked and sat for a while, hands on the steering wheel, watching people move beneath umbrellas. Most of them looked like they were going somewhere. Most of them looked like they had somewhere to be. At 10:56 a.m., she stood at a bus stop on Bay Street with a cardboard box balanced against her hip. The rain soaked through her jacket, cold rivulets running down her neck. She didn't feel it. People moving past her seemed to be operating in a different time zone, a different version of Jacksonville where nurses didn't perform emergency procedures to save officers' lives and then get fired for it. Where the truth was simple. Where a dog tag didn't carry 20 years of weight in a broken chain. She'd packed the mug first, wrapped it in a scrap of newspaper from the break room. Then the half-dead succulent from her locker, its soil dried out weeks ago, leaves brittle as old paper. And finally, the photograph, slipped into a manila envelope, not sealed. Natalie at 23 years old, hair pulled back in a tactical bun, dust from the Kandahar airfield still coating her flight suit, holding a small boy with dark eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Jacob Reese, 8 years old. Clutching a dog tag from her father's chain, the one she'd given him when she'd stabilized him in a field hospital, when the odds said he wouldn't make it out alive, when she'd needed him to have something to hold on to besides trauma and fear. The bus pulled up at 10:52 a.m. She didn't board it. She stood there in the rain, watching it pull away, watching the people inside settle into their seats, watching the city move forward in its rhythmic, indifferent way. Her apartment was small, a one-bedroom in a converted historic building on Forsyth Street, the kind of place where the pipes rattled and the floorboards spoke in 3 different languages depending on the season. She'd chosen it specifically for that reason. Noise meant less thinking. Proximity to others meant less isolation. But now, standing in the doorway at 11:34 a.m. with the cardboard box still balanced against her hip, the apartment felt like an echo chamber. She set the box on the bed and opened it. The mug. The succulent. The photograph. Evidence of a life that was supposed to have been finished 3 years ago. When she'd taken the position at Sacred Heart, she'd made a choice. Natalie the soldier would stay buried. Natalie the nurse would be unremarkable. Natalie the person would simply exist in the margins, healing people without asking to be remembered, speaking quietly, deferring to authority, performing the role of someone small enough to be invisible. Instead, she'd gotten recognized. Not by Commander Reese, he hadn't seen her in the hallway. He hadn't known. But she'd known. And in knowing, in seeing his face, in watching her hands move through that emergency procedure with muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing school, she'd blown the whole careful fiction apart. She began folding clothes into a suitcase. 2 pairs of jeans. 3 shirts. 1 pair of scrubs, the one she'd been issued when she started at Sacred Heart. She wasn't sure why she was packing them. She wouldn't need them anymore. But her hands knew what they were doing, moving with the same efficiency they'd used on a field hospital floor 20 years ago, when staying busy meant not thinking about what you'd just done, about whether the 8-year-old was going to live, about whether his father was actually dead or just seemed that way in the light. The rain continued outside. Jacksonville in October had its own particular smell, salt and wet concrete and the ghost of humidity, like the earth hadn't quite learned how to dry out. She sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph still in her hand. 8-year-old Jacob smiled up at her with a child's absolute trust. She'd kept this image hidden for 2 decades because keeping it hidden was safer. Keeping it hidden meant she could be just a nurse. Keeping it hidden meant no one would ask questions about the steadiness in her hands or the way she moved during crises with the fluid precision of someone trained in violence. But keeping secrets, she was starting to understand, had a half-life. They broke down eventually. They seeped into the world the way radiation seeped into water. She slipped the photograph back into its envelope and placed it carefully in the suitcase, underneath the folded clothes, where it would be safe but also out of sight. Out of sight but not gone. Nothing was ever really gone. Everything you'd seen, everything you'd survived, every life you'd held in your hands when the world was burning, it all stayed with you. It just learned to be quiet. It just waited. The suitcase was half full when her phone buzzed at 2:33 p.m. A text from HR, your final paycheck will be mailed. Please return your access badge and hospital ID by Friday. She read it once, then deleted it. She placed the badge on the kitchen counter next to her apartment keys. Tomorrow she would decide what came next. The monitor alarm screamed at 11:53 p.m. Commander Jacob Reese's oxygen saturation had been holding steady at 98% for 6 hours post-op, his vital signs textbook perfect, when his blood pressure crashed from 128/82 to 91/54 in the span of 43 seconds. The on-call surgeon, Dr. Marcus Webb, stood at the bedside staring at the numbers climbing upward on the screen like he was watching a language he'd forgotten how to read. His hands hung at his sides. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The resident beside him called for backup. Crash cart. Code blue. The words echoed through Sacred Heart's corridors at 11:48 p.m., and Natalie was 3 floors down in the supply closet, restocking the night shift trauma kits, when she heard the overhead speaker crackle, "Code blue, 4th floor ICU, room for 12. Code blue, 4th floor ICU, room for 12. Room for 12. She didn't move. Not immediately. Her hands froze mid-motion, holding a packet of 14-gauge angiocath needles. The supply closet smelled like plastic and antiseptic, artificial and sterile, and her brain processed the location with the precision of a targeting computer locking onto a heat signature. 4th floor. Reese's room. The one she'd walked past 17 times in the last 3 days without stopping, without looking. Her hands started moving. The needles went back in the box. The box went on the shelf. She was already moving toward the door when her breath caught, not from fear, but from recognition. That sound. That specific rhythm of the overhead code announcement. She'd heard it before. In the dark. In the sand. When time stopped being measured in seconds and started being measured in heartbeats. She took the stairwell instead of the elevator. Faster. 8 steps at a time, her legs remembering the burn, her lungs remembering the weight. The door to the 4th floor ICU swung open at 11:50 p.m., and she could hear them before she could see them, the crash cart, the chest compressions, the voice of Dr. Webb saying 2 minutes of no perfusion with the tone of someone reading from a script he didn't understand. Natalie moved through the threshold like a ghost materializing from smoke. The resident saw her first, confusion flickering across his face because she wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't cleared for this unit anymore, but she was already reaching for the crash cart, her fingers finding the scalpel before anyone could speak. The blade was cold. Familiar. The same weight as the knife she'd carried in Kandahar, though this one had never known blood, would know it in approximately 8 seconds. "Step back," she said. Not a request. Not soft. The resident actually moved. Dr. Webb turned, mouth opening to protest, but her eyes were already on Reese's chest, the surgical dressing, the exact location of the decompression site, the anatomical landmarks she could read like a map she'd memorized a lifetime ago. His vitals were tanking. Oxygen saturation at 61%. Blood pressure 72/38. The ventilator was pushing air into lungs that weren't accepting it because something had failed, something had collapsed, something had become airlocked in his thoracic cavity in the precise way that kills people in minutes. She made the first incision at 11:51 p.m. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the textbook location, the place she'd learned it first on a boy's thin ribs under a canvas tent while IED shrapnel still whistled overhead. The blade cut through skin and muscle, and a nurse, a real nurse, not a former Marine who hadn't held a scalpel in surgical intent for 20 years, made a sound like a stifled scream. Natalie ignored her. Muscle memory was something else, something deeper than conscious thought. Her hands moved like they'd been doing this every day, every hour, every single moment of the years in between. The hiss of air escaping from the decompression site was immediate and unmistakable. Dr. Webb stared. His mouth moved but no words came. Natalie reached for the tube from the crash cart, a needle decompression device that looked primitive next to the weaponized precision of what she was doing, but her hands were already doing the second decompression before anyone could hand it to her. Second intercostal space, anterior axillary line, the bilateral procedure that was taught in medical school but rarely performed by anyone except trauma surgeons and Marine Corps medical officers who'd trained on live casualties. Irrigation, she said, and a nurse who couldn't remember moving handed her saline. Natalie irrigated the decompression site with the calm of someone who'd done this while artillery rounds shook the earth. Her hands were steady. Rock steady. The kind of steady that only comes from having survived the moment when trembling would have meant death. She sealed the decompression site with a dressing, her fingers working with mechanical precision, and by 11:55 p.m., for minutes, 13 seconds, Reese's oxygen saturation had climbed to 94%. His blood pressure was 106/68 and rising. His heart rate was 118, rapid but organized, the rhythm of a body being returned to the land of the living. The resident was staring at her hands like they'd materialized from another dimension. Dr. Webb's face had gone the color of the ceiling tiles, pale and blank and utterly empty of thought. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, beep, 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 the sound of survival, the sound of a second chance being written in real time. Commander Reese's eyes flickered open. His gaze moved around the room, confused, drugged, bewildered, until it found her face. Something flickered in his expression. Not recognition, not quite, but something older. Something from childhood. A ghost of memory that lived in the part of his brain that remembered a woman's voice in the dark, a pair of hands that held him together, a dog tag pressed into his small fist with the whispered promise, "You're going home. I'm going to get you home." Natalie turned away before the recognition could solidify into words. That's when she saw him. Dr. Ashford stood in the observation window above the ICU, separated from the room by a pane of glass and 20 years of calculated distance. His phone was pressed to his ear. His expression was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was something cold and calculating and furious in a way that had nothing to do with the moment and everything to do with what he'd just witnessed, a nurse performing a procedure that no nurse should have been able to perform, moving with the precision of a surgeon, moving with the confidence of a soldier, moving with hands that had already saved this patient once before and had just proven it by doing it again. His eyes met hers through the glass. She saw him make a note on his phone. She saw him walk away from the window toward his office. She heard herself say, "Call respiratory for a follow-up assessment," in a voice that didn't belong to her. It belonged to someone who'd given orders, who'd been obeyed, who'd made decisions that meant the difference between living and dying. The rest of the night moved in slow motion. By 2 a.m., security had called her into an office. By 2:38 a.m., her badge had been deactivated. By 3:15 a.m., her locker was being cleared by facilities staff, her personal items, the cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," the half-dead succulent she'd been keeping alive for 8 months, a photo of her in desert camouflage holding a small boy outside a field hospital, all of it dumped into a cardboard box. By 4 a.m., she was standing in the rain at a bus stop on Highway 17, the box balanced on her hip, watching the headlights of passing cars blur and refract through the downpour. The rain hammered like applause no one wanted to hear. Inside the box, the photo of 8-year-old Jacob Reese stared upward from beneath the cracked mug, his small hand clutching a dog tag from a chain that no longer existed, a boy who'd grown into a man without knowing the woman who'd saved his life had spent 20 years trying to disappear from the memory of his face. Within 1 hour, Dr. Ashford made 4 phone calls that he believed would bury her completely. The first call went to Chief of Staff Dr. Moss at 2:53 p.m., his voice steady and concerned, the tone of a man protecting institutional integrity. "Dangerous cowboy medicine," he said. "Unauthorized intervention. A trauma nurse performing surgical procedures without attending supervision." He recommended immediate investigation and termination for cause. Dr. Moss listened without interrupting, which Ashford took as agreement. The second call went to HR at 3:12 p.m. He requested that Natalie's security badge be deactivated immediately and her employment file flagged for insubordination and gross negligence. He wanted her belongings removed from her locker before her shift ended so there would be no opportunity for her to remove evidence or speak to colleagues. HR asked if there had been patient harm. Ashford said the harm was potential, which was often enough in their line of work. They agreed. The third call went to the State Nursing Board at 3:34 p.m. He filed a formal complaint, documented and detailed, accusing Major Natalie Hayes of practicing medicine without a license, performing surgical procedures beyond her scope of practice, and demonstrating signs of emotional instability that posed a risk to patient safety. He mentioned her fixation on Commander Reese, her trembling hands during intake, the dog tag she'd hidden in her pocket. He suggested the board might want to investigate her background for prior incidents. The board took the complaint and assigned it a case number. The fourth call went to his attorney at 3:51 p.m. He wanted to build an airtight termination case, something that couldn't be challenged or appealed. He dictated a narrative, a nurse with undisclosed military experience, possibly traumatized, who'd violated multiple protocols, endangered a high-profile patient, and needed to be removed from the facility with documentation so thorough that no court would touch it. His attorney said it was wise to move quickly, before she could file any counter-complaint or go to the media. They hung up at 4:08 p.m. By 4:15 p.m., Natalie's security badge had been deactivated. The card that had opened those doors for 3 years simply wouldn't scan anymore. She learned this when she tried to clock out, standing in the dim hallway outside the ICU, watching the red light blink on the reader. Access denied. A security officer appeared with her hospital locker already emptied into a cardboard box. Not her locker, actually, just a cardboard box that held her belongings. A cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse." A half-dead succulent that hadn't seen sunlight in 6 weeks. A framed photograph of an 8-year-old boy with a smile that belonged to better light than a hospital's fluorescent glare, his small hand clutching a dog tag from a chain that no longer existed. The security officer handed her the box without meeting her eyes. "Hospital policy," he said. She took it. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask why her locker had been cleared without her permission or who had the authority to seize her personal property before she'd been officially fired. She just took the box and walked out through the back entrance that faced the parking lot where the rain had stopped but left everything gleaming and slick and dangerous underfoot. The rain started again around 5 p.m. She sat in her apartment with the box on the kitchen table, staring at the photograph as water dripped from her hair onto the laminate surface, each drop marking time the way a clock could never quite capture. The boy in the picture had grown into a man who would probably recover fully from his emergency thoracotomy, who would probably return to active duty, who would probably never know that the woman who'd saved his life in Kandahar had just been erased from the hospital system with the same efficiency of a surgical strike. But that wasn't the worst part. The State Nursing Board complaint triggered a mandatory federal audit protocol that nobody at Sacred Heart had anticipated, least of all Dr. Ashford. Federal law required that when a complaint was filed against nursing staff at a facility receiving military patients, which Sacred Heart did, extensively, through its Department of Defense contracts, the entire facility's medical records underwent automatic review by federal auditors. It wasn't optional. It wasn't negotiable. It was triggered the moment Ashford's complaint landed in the state system, and within 18 hours, a team of federal investigators with DOD credentials had been assigned to the hospital. Dr. Moss received the notification at 6:40 a.m. the next morning. A Marine liaison officer named Colonel Patricia Romero, attached to Naval Medical Command, arrived at the hospital at 7:15 a.m. with 2 federal investigators and a staggering amount of institutional authority. They wanted to review Commander Reese's surgical records, pre-operative assessments, post-operative care notes, medication administration records, and every personnel decision related to his care. Routine protocol, they explained, their voices carrying the kind of authority that made routine sound like an inspection before a firing squad. By 9:08 a.m., they'd found the first discrepancy. A thoracic case from 8 months prior. Patient admitted with chest trauma from a motor vehicle accident. Ashford had supervised the surgery. The post-operative chart documented what appeared to be iatrogenic injury, a complication caused by the surgical team, in this case supposedly due to improper post-operative nursing care. A nurse had been reassigned. A resident had been counseled. The file was closed, labeled as a learning opportunity. But the federal investigators had access to the hospital's digital systems at a level that bypassed administrative oversight. They could see the original timestamps, the preliminary notes, the chart amendments made in real time. They could see that Ashford had accidentally nicked the right subclavian artery during the initial surgical approach. They could see that he'd controlled the bleeding but delayed calling for the attending physician because he believed he could repair the injury without escalation. They could see that the patient had coded 63 minutes later from uncontrolled hemorrhage into the chest cavity. They could see that Ashford had then amended the operative note to suggest the complication was post-operative, not intraoperative, which shifted liability from the surgeon to the nursing staff. The original note had been deleted, but the digital forensics team recovered it anyway. Digital ghosts never stayed buried. They haunted servers forever. By 11:41 a.m., the investigators had found the second case. an orthopedic surgery from 14 months back. A woman, 62 years old, presenting with a fractured radius and ulna. Ashford had performed the open reduction and internal fixation. Postoperatively, she'd lost nearly complete function in her left hand. The chart blamed postoperative care, inadequate hand therapy, possibly the patient's age and healing capacity. The case was closed. The family filed a complaint, then withdrew it after Ashford's attorney sent a letter explaining how difficult litigation could become. The federal investigators found the original surgical video recorded a standard protocol for teaching cases. They watched Ashford's hands during the procedure. They watched him place the plates incorrectly, the screws at an angle that would inevitably create dysfunction. They watched him close the wound without addressing the vascular compromise that was obvious from the swelling. They watched him document none of it. Then they watched the amended chart, filed the next morning, that suggested the complication was related to postoperative immobilization rather than surgical technique. The pattern became visible at 1:15 p.m. when Colonel Romero walked into the conference room where Dr. Moss and the hospital's legal team were gathering. 7 cases over 2 years, she said, her voice like a tank idling in a garage, waiting for the target to move. 7 documented discrepancies between initial operative records and amended charts. 7 instances where surgical error appeared to have been reclassified as nursing error or postoperative complication. 7 cases where the same surgeon, Dr. Richard Ashford, had supervised the care. She placed a folder on the table. It was thick. It was official. It had federal seals on the cover, which meant it carried the weight of institutions so large and powerful that they could reshape entire careers with a single document. Dr. Ashford initiated a state board complaint against Major Hayes this morning, Colonel Romero said. That complaint triggers this audit protocol. The audit protocol reveals that Dr. Ashford has committed systematic fraud across multiple patient cases, falsified medical records, and attempted to conceal surgical negligence. She looked directly at Dr. Moss. Your facility is now under federal investigation. Dr. Ashford's medical license is suspended pending review. His employment is terminated for cause, effective immediately. And his personal liability exposure exceeds $12 million in documented damages across the cases we've reviewed so far. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when professional lives ended in real time, when men like Dr. Ashford went from holding institutional power to holding nothing but the memory of it, which was the worst kind of nothing. Dr. Moss's face had gone the color of hospital walls, institutional gray, morally neutral, completely without blood. His attorney was already making phone calls. Sacred Heart's legal team was already calculating exposure and damage control. And Dr. Richard Ashford, who had spent his entire career building a reputation so carefully constructed that it felt like armor, discovered that armor was only as strong as the first person who examined it closely. By 4 p.m., his medical license was suspended. By 5 p.m., he'd been terminated from Sacred Heart for cause, which meant no severance, no references, and liability for his own legal defense. By 6 p.m., the first of what would become 7 malpractice suits had been filed against him personally, with astronomical damages claims and federal support behind them all. His attorney explained the situation with the clinical precision of a man who delivered bad news to worse men 1,000 times. Ashford's personal liability insurance would cover the first $3 million. After that, it was his assets. His house, his retirement accounts, his future earnings. The federal investigation would likely expand beyond these 7 cases. There would be depositions. There would be criminal referral recommendations. There was a possibility of criminal charges for falsifying medical records, which was a federal crime when patient safety was involved. Dr. Richard Ashford had launched an investigation to destroy a woman he'd never bothered to truly see, and instead he'd lit a fire that consumed him entirely. And Natalie, sitting in her apartment with the photograph of an 8-year-old boy who'd become a man, had no idea any of it was happening. She was packing her belongings into boxes, preparing to disappear again, preparing to become someone else in some other city where nobody knew she'd been a nurse or a soldier or a woman who'd performed field surgery with a combat knife in a sandstorm. She was preparing to become invisible again, which had always been her greatest skill. She didn't know that in exactly 11 days, her 16-year-old son Marcus would arrive at her apartment door carrying a shadow box. She didn't know he would refuse to accept her surrender. She didn't know he would drive to Sacred Heart Hospital with medals that proved she'd never been nobody. And she didn't know that the man whose life she'd saved in Kandahar, the boy whose face she'd carried in photographs for 20 years, was about to walk into a board meeting and speak her true name for the first time in her adult life. The rain hammered against the window. The photograph stared upward from the cardboard box. And Major Natalie Hayes sat very still, her breathing measured and controlled, the way she'd learned to breathe when breathing was the only thing keeping you alive. The question wasn't whether she would survive this. She'd survived worse. The question was whether she would finally stop surviving and start living. And that answer was coming faster than anyone except her son had predicted. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever had to hide who you really are, please like this video, subscribe to the Code Whisperers for more stories of hidden strength, and comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Your stories matter. Your truth matters. Watch the next segment to see how one photograph changes everything.